Hello, government students. Today we're going to be doing notes 4.3 Civil Rights, Equal Justice Under the Law. So, your central question: how has the court system impacted civil rights? On your test next week, I will ask you to describe one civil rights case that has impacted civil rights in the United States in US history. So, just make sure you note that as we're going through our notes today. All right, so as we know in the United States, we have a heterogeneous society. So we have a society that's composed of a lot of different types of people who live in the United States. Our population, of course, has changed over time. If you remember from US history, our nation is a nation of immigrants. So the first people who lived on this land were, of course, the indigenous people. We have immigrated from a lot of countries that have created the United States. When we first were creating, we had a lot of immigrants coming over from Europe, and then we have grown in our populations. We've had African American, Latinx, and Asian American populations that have grown at rates several times that for the white population, so we're becoming more diverse as time goes on. And women make up a greater percentage in the population than males. So, all of this has forced our government to have to change a little bit because remember, our Constitution was written by our founding fathers. So, a bunch of privileged white men were the ones who created this document, right? They were rich, they owned land, they were white, they were male. So, that's who they were creating the society for. So, we have a history of prejudice in this country. Our power structure of the United States, our government is white male dominated and still is to this day. The majority of people in power in both the executive, legislative, and judicial branches are white and male. And the United States has been historically reluctant to yield full and equal places in society for both minorities and women. I'm going to go over some brief civil rights history for you that I'm hopeful you all learned in your US history classes. Discrimination against African Americans receives the most attention in US history. That's the one that's covered more than anything else. They are the second largest minority group in the United States. And of course, African Americans were brought to this country as enslaved people. And since slavery, they have been victims of constant and deliberate unjust treatment. Most of the gains America has made in terms of equality have come from efforts made by and on behalf of African Americans. Latinx Americans are our largest minority group in the United States, and they're also the most rapidly growing. So, not only are they the biggest minority group, but they're growing at higher rates than other groups. In California, right here in California, Latinx students were actually placed in separate schools based on their ethnicity until 1945. So they were separated based on race. Of course, we know Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta here. They co founded the National Farm Workers Association and they helped provide better working conditions for Hispanic and Filipino workers in California. Recently, we've had more issues like the DREAM Act that have fought for equality for people who have immigrated here to the United States. The LGBTQ community has also fought for civil rights in the United States. Until 1973, homosexuality was actually classified as a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric Association. Right here in California, we had a proposition on our ballot in 1978, Prop 6, and this would have actually banned gays and lesbians and any gay and lesbian supporting teacher from working in a California school. That luckily got voted down, but yes, that was something that we voted here not too long ago, 1978 in California. But the Supreme Court has expanded civil rights for the LGBTQ community. So, of course, we had the Supreme Court case Obervelt versus Hodges in 2015, where the Supreme Court decided that we would have marriage equality across the United States. So, that means in every state, all 50 states, it is legal for LGBTQ couples to get married, just like it's legal for straight couples to get married. And more recently, just this last summer, June of 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that it's not legal to fire someone for being LGBTQ. So before last year, you could still fire someone in over 27 states for being gay in 2020. But that's changed thanks to the Supreme Court for expanding those rights. Unfortunately, they're still fighting for a lot of rights today. Many states still allow things called conversion therapy for minors, where parents can send their kids to camps where they try to change their children's sexual orientation by methods of torture. There are still 16 states with no hate crimes for LGBTQ people, and transgender people are still fighting for their rights in many, many states. They're also disproportionately affected by hate crimes than other groups. The United States has a majority of women. 51% of the population in the United States is women, but unfortunately, they still, on average, earn less than men. They make up less of Congress than men do, and they make up less of the state legislatures than men do. They also have underrepresentation in corporate management as well. So they're making less and they're represented less of the people who are in charge in this country. As you can see up here, for every $1 that a white male will make in the United States, a white woman will make 77 cents, an African American woman will make 64 cents, and a Latinx woman will, or a Latina will make 56 cents. So those numbers unfortunately go down as we go. And then you can see this is not just something that's happening in one field or another, this is across different fields. Women are making less in all sorts of jobs and professions. So we have something called the glass ceiling in America. This is the barrier to advancement in a profession. So this affects women and affects members of minority groups. They call it a glass ceiling because you can see the top, you can see where you could potentially be, but you just can't quite get there. So, like the glass ceiling in a political example would have been Hillary Clinton in 2016, her presidential campaign. She could see that position. A lot of people thought that she was going to become president, but she didn't quite break that glass ceiling yet. One of the Supreme Court cases that has to do with gender is Moritz versus the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, so the IRS. We're going to watch a movie about this court case next week. This was a court case that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, when she was a lawyer, she brought up to the Supreme Court in 1972. This was a court case that said that you could not get a tax deduction for being a caretaker if you were a male. So, if you were a man and you were taking care of a sick or an elderly family member, you could not get a tax break for it. But if you were a woman, you could because it was something that seemed like women's work. So, women were supposed to take care of elderly or sick family members, but men weren't supposed to do that. So, women could get the tax break, but men couldn't. So, this was a court case that discriminated against men because of their gender. Our Constitution has the 14th Amendment, and in the 14th Amendment, we have the Equal Protection Clause. That's where a lot of our civil rights have come from. When they go up to the Supreme Court and people are arguing for equality among the law, it is because of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This says that citizens are protected equally under the law. The only mention of sex in the Constitution is the 19th Amendment, which forbids the denial of the right to vote on account of sex. So that means sex was not considered as part of any constitutional law prior to 1920. So since then, we have been using the 14th Amendment, we have been using the Constitution to defend all kinds of rights for individuals in the United States. Some of those examples were laws that struck down segregation. Of course, we know we have segregation in our American history. Segregation is the separation of one group from another. As we learned earlier in the semester, when we learned about the 13th Amendment and the ending of slavery, the Jim Crow laws soon got passed after slavery ended in the late 1800s in several states during Reconstruction, and this separated minorities from the white population. This separate but equal doctrine was upheld by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court case was Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 and said that it was legal to have separate facilities as long as they were equal to the white facilities. So you could have a black school and a white school as long as they're both equal. But as we know, these facilities are never going to actually be equal. So in 1954, the Supreme Court struck down separate but equal in 1954 in the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education. And this situation, it was actually a group of cases. There was actually 5 different cases that were brought up, but they combined them all together. Brown, this little girl, she was actually just a 6-year-old little girl who wanted to go to her neighborhood school and was not allowed to go because she was African American and the school was a white school. They used psychology in this case, proving that students, when they were separated based on race, African American students would see themselves as inferior to the white students. So, this Supreme Court case led to desegregation. So, we had desegregation in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, where we were continuing to integrate the schools. We still have a lot of segregation in the United States today. Some of that is de facto segregation, so segregation that we have even if no law requires it. So, like a lot of areas in the country, or even if we look at some communities in Sacramento, we have a lot of areas that are separated based on race. We had civil rights acts happening in the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination against any person on the grounds of race, color, religion, national origin, sex, physical disability in any federally funded program. But it did not include sexual orientation. As we know, LGBTQ people are still discriminated against in the United States today. We also had the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which prevented that discrimination in housing. So recently, we have tried to take steps to remedy these past discriminations in a policy called affirmative action. And this requires employers or colleges to take positive steps to remedy these effects of these past discriminations. So here in California, we've had some cases against this. So we actually had a case against the University of California system for what someone called reverse discrimination. And then they were saying that they were discriminated against because they weren't one of these minority groups that would have been benefited from affirmative action, and they were denied entry into the college, into the UC system. So now race cannot be used as the only factor in making a decision for college admittance. So when we're accepting people into colleges, when you all apply for colleges, they still can use your race as one factor, along with your grades, along with your SAT scores, all of those things, but it won't be the only factor they use. In November of this past year, we voted on California Prop 16. This was something to have affirmative action in California for the government. So, not only for it to be for colleges, but also in places of employment. So, they could use race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin to try to increase diversity in a lot of hiring places. But unfortunately, this did not pass in California, so we did not allow more diversity in hiring. Right, so citizenship in the United States, a citizen is a member of a state or a nation who owes its full allegiance to it by birth or naturalization, is entitled to full civil rights. So, pretty much, if you were born here in the United States, then you are a citizen, or you can become a citizen by naturalization. Okay, so jus soli is the law of the soil or where one is born. So the 14th Amendment to the Constitution says that any person born within the United States or any of its territories is, of course, a citizen of the United States. You can also be a citizen of the United States by birth, even if you weren't born here. But if you were born by someone who was a citizen or who is a citizen of the United States. So if your family happens to be abroad and your mother gives birth to you, if at least one of your parents is a citizen of the United States, you can petition for citizenship. And then, of course, we have naturalization, which is the legal process by which a person becomes a citizen of another country sometime after birth. So you can become a citizen of the United States. You do have to pay it used to be $600. I'm not sure what the fines are now, but you do have to file and pay the fines, and you do also have to take a test. That was that test, if you can remember, we took way back at the beginning of the semester, that citizenship test, questions in English based on US history and the government. Expatriation is the legal process by which loss of citizenship occurs. This can be a voluntary act. If you choose to move to another country and get citizenship there, you can choose to leave the United States and give up your citizenship. An individual cannot have their citizenship taken away for breaking a law, though. Denaturalization is the process by which citizens can lose their citizenship involuntarily, but this does not happen very often. Usually, it's only because the person became a citizen by committing some sort of fraud when they were becoming a citizen in the first place. Congress has the exclusive power to regulate immigration, so that is up to the legislative branch. And over time in the United States, we've had a lot of issues with immigration. So we banned a lot of people from coming to the United States in the first place. In 1965, we allowed over a quarter million immigrants into the United States each year. But we are also having massive numbers of deportations in the United States. So, deportations is the legal process in which an undocumented person is legally required to leave the United States. Frequently, we have people who get deported. We drive them over the border and they are dropped off in Mexico, even if that is not their original country of origin. So, a lot of people are being dropped off in Mexico, even though they are from various other countries in South and Central America. So, in the United States, we've tried various attempts to reform immigration. We have the DREAM Act and we have DACA. So, DACA was signed in 2012 under the Obama administration. DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This has allowed more than a half million people in the United States who were brought here as children, undocumented children, and they immigrated here to the United States. They were brought here from their parents. They didn't necessarily have a say because they were children, but this allows them to be able to live in the United States and to work here legally. We have also tried to pass something called the DREAM Act at the federal level. The DREAM Act would grant residency for undocumented people, and it would provide them eventual permanent residency in the United States. This also lets them get things like driver's licenses and work permits. Currently in California, we do have a DREAM Act. So if you are, obviously you are living in California, but if you're a resident of California, you can apply for the DREAM Act. You can fill out your paperwork, and that way, when you apply to college, you can pay things like in state tuition, you can get a driver's license, all of those things. So you can get those things in California under the DREAM Act, but unfortunately, this did not pass the federal government, so we don't have a national DREAM Act, just a state one. Okay, so this is DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival. So you do have to have come to the United States before you were 16 years old. Okay, and you have to have lived here since at least 2007, which most of you have. So you can get work permits, you can get student loans, you can get a driver's license, you can get a social security number, all of those things if you file for DACA. Okay. And then unfortunately, we're still having a crisis at the border today. So a lot of people who are at the border today are seeking asylum. So what I need you to know is these people who are coming to the United States today, they are not coming here illegally. They are coming here seeking asylum. This is a legal process by which refugees will come to the United States border and they'll ask for safety and protection in the United States. These are people who are fleeing war, gang violence, poverty, all kinds of issues that would cause them to leave their countries. Now, they're coming here to the United States and they're seeking asylum. So they're seeking a safe place in our country. It is a legal process, again, I will say, but they are brought here and then they're put in these detention centers, pretty much the prisons for immigrants. They're put there while they process all of the paperwork and decide whether they're going to let them into the country or not. All right, and the last part of our notes here, I was just going to quickly go over jury duty, just so you all know what jury duty is, because this is something that you're potentially going to have to deal with. So, jury duty is an element of citizenship in the United States. This here is the Yolo County Courthouse. If you get jury duty, you're probably going to get called to go here. It is in Woodland. Once you turn 18, you will have the ability to serve on a jury. This is one of the most important responsibilities of citizenship in the United States. So, what they'll do is they'll send you a little postcard looking thing. It's called a summons a few weeks before your date. You'll have to call the night before to see if you need to report for jury duty. And if you do have to report for jury duty, you go the morning of, And then you go in, you check in, and you have to wait for jury selection. So they'll go and they'll interview you, they'll ask you some questions and determine whether they want you on the jury or not. In order to be on a jury, you have to be a US citizen, have to be at least 18. You can't be incarcerated, you can't be on parole or probation, and you cannot be a registered sex offender. If you're not those things, you're at least 18 and you're a US citizen, then you will be able to serve on a jury. The average trial only lasts about 3 to 6 days. They're pretty quickly done. You can be required to serve on a jury every 12 months, but it usually happens far less often than that. And you're only selected to be on a jury if both sides agree to have you as a juror. So you'll get questions from both of the lawyers on each side. And if they both agree, then you will be able to serve on the juror for jury duty. I would say most people in society have not served on a jury. I still have not served on a jury. I got close this last year. I got to the point where both the lawyers were asking me questions, but then I was dismissed, unfortunately. So I still haven't served on a jury, even though I would really like to. But it doesn't happen very often. They'll send you those summons every few years. All right, and that's the end of your notes for today. So don't forget to write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned.